So today I have the great honor to interview, who I consider the rock star of the animal movement. It's Peter Singer. It is exactly 50 years ago that he wrote Animal Liberation, the groundbreaking book in which, among other things, he calls for a boycott of meat. And we can safely say that this book ignited the animal movement that we know today. Peter is a moral philosopher and a now retired professor of bioethics at Princeton University. But despite being 78, am I correct?
Correct, yes.
It doesn't seem like he has really slowed down since then. What I admire most about his work is that he doesn't only make abstract philosophical analysis of what is right and what is wrong, but that he isn't afraid to apply these theories to real-world dilemmas that we face today, such as global poverty, how to donate effectively, and, of course, the treatment of animals. 2 years ago, he released an updated edition of his influential book titled Animal Liberation Now. How does he look back on 50 years of animal movements? Where are we now, and what strategies should we develop for the future? So we are sitting here in the Balie in Amsterdam to discuss these topics. Peter Singer, welcome. It's a great honor to interview you.
Thank you very much, Esther. It's good to be with you.
So this year, it is exactly 50 years ago that you wrote this book, Animal Liberation. And I would like to start maybe going back to the moment that you wrote it. I think you were 28 back then when it was published. Could you take me back to the first time that you held this book in your hands?
Oh, right. Do I even remember the first time that I held it in my hands? So it was first published in the United States.
Yeah.
I was living in Australia by then, though I had been in the United States a little bit before. And so I think I only saw it when I came over to do a publicity tour, because the publisher invited me to come to the US to do publicity. So I think that's when I first actually saw the book. I like the way it was presented very much. Okay. It's you can find it online. It's a largely white cover with a version of there's an American painting called The Peaceable Creation, which refers to the line from the book of Isaiah about the lion lying down with the lamb. Uh-huh. And there's a group of animals, including a lion and a lamb, there as part of that. But there's a lot of white space, and there's the words Animal Liberation, which of course was very exciting for me to see because, that term had not really been around. It was not used at that stage. So just the very cover was going to be something new. If anybody saw it in a bookshop, they were going to say, what's that all about?
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's hard to imagine for us right now that it was such a novelty back then. Did it take a lot of courage for you to write this book as a 20-year-old promising philosopher, to write such a, I could say a bit of an activist, very concrete book?
I don't know that it took a lot of courage. I suppose, the main concern was that it would damage my career in philosophy because philosophers at that stage were not writing about practical issues. It was rather they were supposed to be analysing moral concepts, discussing whether morality is objective or subjective, but applying yourself to a practical issue as I did in Animal Liberation and writing for a general reader, not just for other philosophers, and including quite a lot of factual material. That, I could see that my colleagues might think that this is not really philosophy.
Yeah, and did they?
Some did, yes. Some didn't think that this kind of thing was philosophy, but it actually didn't hurt my career at all. I was rather fortunate, I think, that there was a position as a professor vacant at a university in Melbourne, where I was living, at Monash University, which I applied for, and the people on that selection committee, not all philosophers, of course, a broader committee, were interested in having somebody who would say something to the public. I think they thought that it would draw some attention to the university. So I was appointed as a professor by the time I was 31, I think. So it obviously didn't hurt my career at all. And I was fortunate in that respect.
Yeah. I'm just realizing, as you said, there was a lot of factual information also about factory farming, which was
and about animal experiments as well. There's a lot about that. Yes, that's right.
And I just realized that you wrote it in a time where there was no internet available. I'm just trying. There wasn't even a computer available. I think I'm trying to envision how you, as a philosopher, gathered all this information about what was happening in factory farming.
Well, as I said, I had been in the United States before. I'd had a one-year visiting position at New York University. and I stayed on for some months over the North American summer. Or actually, no, it was really more like 6 months because my next job was in Australia. And so I finished my job at New York University in May or June. And then my next job in Australia was starting at the end of the Australian summer, which is February, March. So I really had 6 months to work, and I stayed in New York to do that. And I spent a lot of that 6 months in the New York Public Library. And that's where I gathered the information. I read farming journals because they were describing for other farmers how to get the biggest profits out of animals, which meant they were describing, how many hens you could squeeze into one of these wire cages or how many pigs you could have. And then for the animal experimentation chapter, of course, all the scientific journals were there, and it was a matter of looking at the journals that published a lot of animal experimental work and learning some of the more technical terms that they used, but then describing for the general reader what was actually happening to the animals. So it was hard work, and I have to say it was emotionally hard work.
Was it?
Because I was, especially the experiments. I mean, both of them, but especially the experiments really, you read about quite horrible things that were being done to animals.
Would you be able to share something with us that struck you most?
Subjecting animals to inescapable electric shock was something that was done in psychology experiments. It was supposed to produce something that was in some respects like depression in humans. They called it learned helplessness. So they would take an animal and they would put it in an enclosure where the whole floor could be electrified and there was no way of getting off that floor. And they would give repeated electric shocks to animals, including dogs. Not, to me it's just as bad to do it to a rat as it is to do it to a dog, but there were dogs involved too. And after a while, at first the dogs or the animals would try to escape whatever way they could, but then after a while they couldn't, and they just passively lay on the floor and took this shock. And it was, it was obviously not going to be a really good model of depression, and it hasn't led to any cures from depression. So, it was horrible to actually have to read all of this and the amount of animal suffering that was going on. But at the same time, in a way, it made me more determined to get through this, to write it up in the clearest way that I possibly could to influence the greatest number of people in the hope that I could change this.
Yeah. And what did it do to you emotionally?
Well, it gave me some sleepless nights, certainly, and it was fairly tough. But I tried to, after I'd come home from the library, join my wife who was there with me, and we would go out and do other things, and I would try to forget about it, or we'd go hiking in the nature in the Hudson Valley somewhere, which was a beautiful place. So I would get it out of my head. I think I'm lucky though that some people I think would have been more disturbed and just not able to go on with it. And I think somehow I developed a thick skin and, as I say, this determination to record it and get it out there made me go on with it. And I don't think it did any lasting damage to me at all.
Has it become easier for you to learn about these atrocities?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I know about them, and if I hear about more, I can take it now. But I have the kind of personality that always tries to look on the positive side, so I don't focus on the horrible things that continue to happen unless I need to show, for example, in the new edition of Animal Liberation Now, obviously I needed to show that there are still bad things being done to animals. But it doesn't disturb me to the same extent that it did.
So once it was published and you went on this book tour, what were your expectations for the book?
I didn't know what to expect, really, because it was something new. On the one hand, I thought, people don't know this. This is really horrible. This is when I learned about factory farming, that made me become a vegetarian. So I hope that it will have the same effect on a lot of other people. But on the other hand, I also realized that I was up against these huge industries, obviously, both the factory farming industry and the industry of producing animals for research and doing research with them. They were both huge industries. And I thought, do I really have any hope of making any change? So I had these two extremes. I had the idea that on the one hand, this book will change everything. People will read it. They will talk about it to their friends. They will say, oh my goodness, we've got to stop eating meat, or at least we've got to stop buying products from factory farms. And on the other hand, I had this idea that, well, it's going to be, the industries will come out with their sort of public relations exercises to try and push it away, and it'll disappear.
Yeah. So when we talk about that first bit about changing the minds of people about how we treat animals, have you been disappointed in how willing people are to be ethically in this way?
So, yes, clearly I'm disappointed that it has not been as effective as I had hoped it would, that there are still factory farms. In fact, there are more animals in factory farms now than there were in 50 years ago. So that's disappointing. But on the other hand, there are quite a lot of people who have changed their lives because of it. They've changed their lives in terms of what they eat. They've started up animal organizations, organizations like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals is one such organization that was started. And just yesterday I was in Brussels with Michel van den Bosch, who started Gaia, the Belgian animal advocacy group, and he said he started that after reading Animal Liberation. So, it has had an effect. It has had an effect on people who've not only changed their lives individually, but have done something career-wise to change their lives and to change the lives of other people. So it hasn't, the worst scenario that I envisaged has not come about, and the best scenario that I envisaged has not come about. It's somewhere in between, and that gives me hope still that eventually more people will realise that we don't need to eat animals, that we're completely unjustified in the way we treat animals, and that would be better for not only animals but the climate and the world if we changed.
I'm wondering if you still have that hope, because I can absolutely see what you're saying. It sparked a lot of the animal liberation movement, directly influenced by your book. There's a lot of people, fighting for animals at the moment, but still, when you look at the larger scale, at the amount of people that is still eating animals, even though all this information is still available, I could also imagine that you could become quite pessimistic about human nature and about the will to do the right thing.
Well, let's say I've certainly become less optimistic about human nature. That's true. And the will to do the right thing is not always there. But there's a long tradition of people who have been fighting to do the right thing. You can think back to the anti-slavery movement and the women's movement and many other movements. And the animal movement has also been going in some form or another for a couple of hundred years. So I think that eventually this line of thought, this way of acting is going to come out on top. But obviously it's going to be a lot longer than I had hoped it would be, and I'm not going to be around to see its final victory. But I do think that progress has been made and generally still is being made in this area, and I think we will get there eventually.
Do you think humanity will become more moral on the long run?
This is what I've argued, not just in Animal Liberation, but in a book called The Expanding Circle, that the long-term tendency of morality is to expand outwards, that morality started in small tribal groups. Anthropologists and those who study human prehistory tell us that humans lived in small groups, maybe 100, 150 people, and morality was first concerned about the social relations within that group. And if you came from a different group, you weren't going to be protected. You didn't have a moral status that meant that people should not harm you from different groups. And gradually that circle pushed outwards to larger groups, countries, races, co-religionists, and I suppose with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, we had, at least on paper, the idea that all human beings are included in the sphere of morality and have basic rights. And now we've pushed beyond that to some extent. I mean, here in Europe, you have the idea that all animals are sentient beings, that gives them some kind of status different from an item of property or a mere thing. And I think that's a sign that we're pushing beyond the boundary of our species. And there's legislation to also give some protection to animals, not enough, but it's a first step. So yes, I think that we are slowly moving morality outwards, and I think that will eventually include animals.
Because when you just spoke about slavery, how slavery ended, though there's obviously different views on how that ended, but one stream of thought is that it ended for very practical reasons, and that only afterwards people became more moral and realized, like, oh, how could we ever have had slaves? But that such an atrocity doesn't end for moral reasons, but for practical reasons. Do you think that that analogy could also become true for the animal movement?
I don't think that analogy is true for slavery.
You don't?
Certainly not for the abolition of the slave trade, which was done by people with significant overlap, incidentally, for the people who founded the first Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which later became the Royal Society. I think they were clearly morally motivated. The slave trade was a profitable trade for Britain. And when Britain abolished slavery, not only the slave trade, but slavery in British colonies, they had to compensate the slave owners at substantial sums of money for those days. So I don't agree. I think it's a kind of a rather cynical analysis that says that the anti-slavery movement only got somewhere when slaves were no longer economically useful. That's just not right.
Well, I'm happy to hear that view, because that is a promise for how we treat animals then.
Yeah, I think so. I think we can. I mean, look, there may be similar factors which will make it easier. I know there are people who think that once we can produce cultured meat at the cellular level that is identical with the meat that we now get from animals, and once that is economically competitive with meat from animals, then it will be much easier to get people to be vegetarian or vegan. That's probably true. But I think we can still make progress before that happens, and then we can prepare the ground for when that does happen, so that people have an additional reason for why they should be buying the cultured meat products rather than the products from animals.
Yeah. And then what do you think is the way we can reach people with this moral message about animals? Because I feel like it's so out there, it's so hard not to know what's happening right now, and still so many people are able to ignore it.
Well, I think that there are still quite a few people who don't really know what's happening, or at least they're not vividly aware of what's happening to animals. But it's true, there are some people who are aware of it but don't care about it. And I think that there is a social factor here, that if you're a person who does think, well, maybe I should stop eating animals, but your family and your friends are all still eating animals, there's a sort of obstacle to overcome in that you're implicitly and maybe even explicitly critical of them. You're saying you're doing something that's wrong. And it's hard for us, I think, to do that. You know, we're very social beings. We depend on our friends and our families for support and company. And it's hard to break away from that. But the more people who start to do that, then the easier it gets, because then you have friends and you have your own communities where you're doing the same thing. So I think we have seen numbers of people not eating animals building up over the last couple of decades. And I think eventually we will get enough so that it becomes easier to make that change.
You feel like the social norms are mostly what's hindering people to...
I think that's a large part of it now, that's right.
Yeah. One thing that struck me in your book and also in a recent video of you was your thoughts about conscientious omnivores. I'm very intrigued by that. You basically say that there's people who do accept your arguments against factory farming, but who do feel that it's okay to eat meat from animals that had a good life. And you said, quote, somewhat reluctantly, I would see conscientious omnivores as allies in the movement against factory farming. I'm wondering, do you yourself also think that it is okay to eat meat from animals that have had a good life?
I don't want to eat meat from animals, but I do think that the ethical question of whether it is or is not okay is a more balanced one on which there is something to be said on both sides. Whereas when it comes to factory farming, I think there's really nothing to be said on the side of factory farming. It's not, some people say, well, we need it to feed the world's 8 billion people, but actually it's a waste of food. We have much more food value that we grow, crops we grow going into the animals, because of course when we put them inside we have to provide them with 100% of their food. They can't eat grass themselves. So we're wasting food, so that's not a good reason. And if in the absence of that reason, there's just about no other reasons why factory farming is an ethical practice. But when you do have animals living good lives, and they would not have existed otherwise, that is, they would not have existed had it not been that the person, the farmer, or whoever it is, was going to slaughter them and get some money for the meat or other animal products, then I think there's at least a real question as to whether this is wrong. And so I think I used to, in the first edition of Animal Liberation, I took a harder line against that and said, you're still harming the animal, obviously, that you kill, and you've got to look at the animal in front of you rather than the possible animal who will be born to replace this animal if this animal can be sold commercially. But I now see both philosophical and practical arguments against taking that view. The practical argument is that we need all the allies we can get against factory farming, and in a way I think it makes the issue a lot clearer if you say we should be boycotting products from animals who've had miserable lives, and animals who are confined indoors all their lives have had miserable lives, in very crowded conditions, and conditions not suited for their nature at all. So I think that's the real issue that I think is clear cut, and anyone who's prepared to say, I'm against that, I'm not going to purchase products from factory farmed animals, as I say, I would regard as on the right side against factory farming.
Yeah, and interesting you say it makes things clearer. I could also imagine it makes things a bit more messy. Like, I could imagine that focusing on animal welfare reforms kind of undermines our attempts for abolishment of animals for food. And as I see, especially, well, at least in the Netherlands, is that there's a wide range of labels and certificates, say Better Life, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, organic. There's even farmers making their own brands. So what is a good life, and who is there to decide if it was a good life? So I could imagine it opens the door for all sorts of marketing initiatives, which make it harder to go for your real point, which is that we should abolish any form of the use of animals.
Well, so firstly, is that my real point? Is my real point that we should abolish
Perhaps
any use
isn't,
of animals? Yes. I think I got concerned about this because of the amount of suffering that I was seeing on animals. And it was not a kind of, that phrase, abolish the use of animals, is sort of comes more from the philosophy of Immanuel Kant than of Jeremy Bentham. So, Immanuel Kant says, not for animals. He thinks that animals are means to our ends. But as far as humans are concerned, he's famous for this idea that it's always wrong to use another person, another human being, as a means, treat them as a means rather than as an end. And, that's not my view in ethics. My view in ethics is, as I say, more like Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, who was concerned about maximizing happiness and minimizing pain and suffering. And I still think that is the crucial thing. Now, if you say to people it's okay to eat some animals, then of course there is the question, well, how do you know how much suffering there has been? How do you know that on balance their lives have been worth living? And if you have to rely on labels that are put out by people who have a commercial interest in persuading you that these animals had good lives, then you might be deceived. That's certainly possible. So I think you have to be careful. I wouldn't just rely on a label. You would want to ask, well, what are the standards behind this label? Who is inspecting that the conditions really are that? But, there are also other cases where somebody could be pretty confident. They might live close to a farm that has free-ranging hens, for example, and they see the hens out in the fields every day, or every day when it's not snowy, let's say, and they seem to be scratching around and they're not too crowded and they're having a good life. So, if in those circumstances you think, well, is there harm in buying these eggs? Maybe there's not.
Yeah, so apologies for misquoting there. It was misquoting you there, so I understand for you it's much more about ending the suffering, and it's not so much the killing in itself or the use of animals that is the largest problem for you.
That's right. I mean, obviously we're all going to die. Animals are all going to die as well at some point. I think it's better to have a longer life if the life is of positive quality. It's probably better to have a shorter life if you're in a factory farm, actually, because the life is miserable in itself. And of course, here in the Netherlands, you recognise that sometimes euthanasia is appropriate for humans as well as for animals. So I don't think it's the killing as such that's wrong. It's the quality of the life that we allow animals to have that is the crucial test.
Yeah, and not so much the length of it. It's not like, because like you say, you can also argue when an animal has had such a good life, it's even worse to kill it.
Well, it's worse to kill it, except that the counter-argument for that is, but if we simply allowed it to die of old age, then, this practice would come to an end because we can't afford to keep feeding and looking after these animals unless we kill them at an age when people will pay something for their meat, for their flesh. So, I know a lot of people in the animal movement won't like that. They'll want a more sort of clean-cut kind of stance.
Yeah.
But I think at least the kind of ethics that I have doesn't really allow you to just say killing of animals is always wrong.
So I guess as an activist, or maybe I should say advocate, things are never black and white, and you should always consider whether a specific action or a specific viewpoint really helps the cause.
Yes, that's right. It helps the larger cause. To be too purist might actually harm the cause. So you might have people who would be prepared to join the movement, but exactly what it is that you're going to eat and not. I mean, there's debates among vegans about whether you eat honey, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And some say yes, some say no, it's an animal product, you can't eat it. So, if you're going to have that debate, I've also discussed, and I do in Animal Liberation and Animal Liberation Now, about very simple organisms that I think that are zoologically animals, but that I think are unlikely to feel pain, like an oyster. Oyster has a very rudimentary nervous system. After all, it spends its life anchored on a rock. It doesn't really need to have evolved a sense of pain. So is it wrong to eat oysters? That's, again, there's not, I think, a really clear line on those questions.
And do I understand that you feel like we might be focusing too much on the small things in the end, whereas we should be focusing on the large scale of animals of which we really know that they can suffer?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's how we get more people supporting the cause.
Yeah, we should be more a bit pragmatic, right. if I understand it correctly. Okay, yeah. Talking about the large-scale factory farming, if I understand correctly, after retiring from Princeton University about 3 years ago, you took a position as a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore. Is that correct? I believe you did a tour of lectures, 20 lectures last year throughout China.
23, I think it was.
Oh, God.
Yes.
And you just came back from China as well. If I understand correctly, you're also talking to veterinary students over there.
Occasionally, but that's not the main audience. Most of the invitations were through philosophy departments. So I think there were some veterinary students that I talked to, yes. And I would like to talk to veterinary students, of course. That's important. But in China, because it's really at an earlier stage of awareness about these animal issues, it's more like it was 50 years ago when Animal Liberation was first published. I think the important thing is to actually get the issue discussed and out there. It's not that nobody is concerned about animals. Obviously, there's a Buddhist tradition as well that is concerned about animals, but it doesn't get very much attention. And then there are people who love their dogs and cats. That's true too. But meat consumption has grown enormously in China as it's become more prosperous over the last 20 or 30 years, and that has meant a lot more factory farming. So China now has more animals in factory farms than any other country in the world, and it doesn't have national animal welfare laws that cover farms at all. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and I'm just trying to reach people, to get some debate going, to speak at some of the leading universities, which will educate some of the future leaders of Chinese culture.
Did you say there are no animal welfare laws at all in China?
There are no national animal welfare laws. It's possible that some of the provinces have their own animal welfare laws, but yes, there are no. And there are some. I mean, for the regulation of animal experiments, they're supposed to follow some code of practice, but when you look at some of the experiments, they certainly would not follow. They would not get through a committee in a Western country. Yeah,
and in your view, and also after talking to these veterinarians, do you feel like the conditions are really much worse for animals in China, or are they kind of using all our Western standards, equipment and...
I think they're worse in many ways. So, for example, the egg-laying hens are all in very small cages. And even some of the meat chickens raised for meat are in cages, which is not usual in Western countries. The sows, the mother pigs, are all in those individual stalls, which got prohibited in the European Union and in the United Kingdom and in some American states, though not most of them, about 10 or 15 years ago. So, yes, the conditions are pretty much, whatever you can do to produce the animals cheaply, you're allowed to do.
Mm-hmm. It's a bit... to me, this is like very frustrating to hear that, especially for you, you've been working so long on this topic. In America, some changes have been made. In Europe, a few more, and then there's this whole new industry which is growing even bigger, and it takes a few steps back.
It is very disappointing, yeah, and that's why I spent a month in China last year and was there again for a week or so on my way to Europe. It is depressing that this is happening, but we can't ignore it. I think we have to try to do something about it and hope that China will develop its own distinctive ethics about treating animals, which no doubt will draw from Confucianism to some extent and from Buddhism to some extent. And we have to hope it uses the positive resources in those traditions to come to a position where you can't do what's being done to animals now.
Yeah, but then again, they don't come from such a long tradition of eating so much meat. So perhaps it's easier to turn it back.
It may be, yes. I mean, it was quite funny, really, the way students would stand up and say, well, I agree with you that really I should be vegetarian, but it's so difficult to be a vegetarian in China. And I'm saying, well, why exactly? There are lots of dishes that use tofu, and tofu is a good high-protein food, and there's some very delicious dishes based on tofu. There's Sichuan mapo tofu, which is a highly spiced tofu dish.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's true that that particular mapo tofu has some pork in it. It's not a significant amount of pork. It's like little grains of pork sprinkled through it, which is very annoying if you're a vegetarian. But you can easily prepare it without. And there are places, certainly in the big cities, because of the Buddhist tradition, there are places that are strictly vegetarian. It's kind of a practice that some older Buddhists who have been successful in business, when they retire, they put some money into setting up a Buddhist restaurant which will not serve any animal products, and they believe that this is a good thing to do with their wealth, and so it's really not that difficult. But I suppose their friends want to go to other places, and then they have this social pressure issue.
Yeah, so it's not so much big agri you feel in China that is pushing this.
I don't think that's pushing it. I think that's responded to the fact that people are eating it. Yeah. I think there are other cultural factors. The fact that a lot of people in China were too poor to eat meat means that now that they can afford to eat meat, they want to. It's got a kind of a status. Now I'm eating what the rich people eat.
Yeah.
So that's another factor, I think.
Yeah. So we need fantastic marketing people to turn this around, to turn this idea around that being rich means eating meat.
Yes, maybe. So maybe that's...
Yeah. It sounds like it's so cultural. It's not necessary. The food is there.
That's
the
right.
plant food.
The other foods are certainly there. There's lots of delicious vegetable dishes. There's lots of incredible variety of mushrooms. I happen to love mushrooms, and there's huge variety of mushrooms that the Chinese cook with, and they do many delicious things with them.
Yeah. There's a bit of more of a philosophical questions I wanted to ask you, and that is. Basically, how certain can we be that the way that we currently treat animals is morally wrong? For instance, it's often said like, well, that's your way of looking at it. And in my view, animals are there to serve humans, or the only necessity or the only goal why humans are on Earth is to serve themselves or to live a good life for themselves. So often it's like, well, there's one philosophy saying this and there's the other philosophy saying this. And I'm wondering, are there objective moral truths? Can we objectively say this is wrong, this is the wrong thing to do?
I think we can say that inflicting unnecessary suffering on innocent beings, let's put aside whether punishment is justified, but let's just say innocent beings, is wrong. That, of course, you can be justified in inflicting suffering if it's necessary to prevent greater suffering. But if you're inflicting suffering for when it's not necessary and when there's alternatives that you can eat and you can nourish yourself with and you can be at least as healthy, possibly healthier without eating these products, then I think you can say that it is objectively wrong. Suffering is something that is intrinsically bad. Again, occasionally it may be good because it serves some other purpose, but just taken in itself, the pain or other forms of suffering, I think, are intrinsically bad. I think we know that in our own case when we experience them. We would rather not experience them. And pleasure and happiness are intrinsically good. So, yeah, I do think that there's an objective basis for ethics. And there's largely that. And, well, that you feel that in your own case, and then the idea that you should not sort of give preference to yourself when you're thinking ethically, that you should be prepared to put yourself in the position of others. It's a kind of version of the golden rule. Suggests that inflicting suffering on others when you don't need to is also objectively wrong.
And, well, as you probably imagine, I very much agree with you, and I guess all our listeners do so as well. But then again, we all do hear this quite often. Like, but humans are just there to maximize their own happiness. Or, well, it's fine, it's great that you're vegan, but that's your way to look at it. I have different thoughts about this. And I'm wondering, how can we tackle this? Well, we can look at it from either side. How can we state that it is actually an objective fact that it's the wrong how we treat animals?
Well, firstly, it's just a mistake to say we're here in order to, because we are not placed here for any particular purpose. We have simply evolved by a very long process that has taken billions of years, and we have evolved this capacity to think and reason and be aware of our surroundings and produce arguments. But Aristotle may have thought that the less rational being should serve the more rational, but he wasn't aware of how we evolved. It was pre-Darwin by a couple of thousand years, so he just got that wrong. And, we can read in Genesis about God having given us dominion over the animals, and people interpret that as our right to use them. Interestingly, Pope Francis actually rejected that doctrine in an encyclical called Laudato Si', which was a bit overdue because that doctrine had been around since the time of Augustine, I think, in the 5th century or something, and it was reinforced by Thomas Aquinas. And many Catholics referred to it, but I don't think you can refer to that interpretation of dominion anymore. I think the view that Pope Francis has put forward, and I haven't seen any leading Catholic thinkers deny it, is that if we really think that there is a God and we think that the Bible does indicate his purpose, then his purpose was to make us stewards of creation, but not to treat them as we wish. Francis made, I think, I hope, getting rid of this argument that we are entitled to use animals as we please.
To do with animals whatever we like. Yeah. And do you feel like your fellow philosophers have accepted your point of view on that it is wrong the way we are treating animals right now?
They haven't exactly accepted my point of view particularly. I mean, some of them have. But what's interesting is that in the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of philosophers from different traditions have taken a pro-animal stance. So I mentioned, we talked about Immanuel Kant before, and I mentioned that, in his works, he actually says that animals are merely a means to an end. But the leading Kantian ethical thinker, at least in the English language today, is Christine Korsgaard, who's, I think, just retired as professor at Harvard. And she published a book a decade or so ago called Fellow Creatures, in which, although she holds a Kantian ethic herself, she thinks that Kant just made a fairly obvious mistake in his reasoning when he said that animals are a means to our ends. He assumed that because animals can't be moral agents, that is, we can't hold them morally responsible for what they do because they're not autonomous, self-aware beings, they also couldn't be moral patients. That is, it didn't matter what we did to them. And there's no basis for thinking one or the other. Obviously, newborn babies are not moral agents, but we do think that it matters what we do to them. And Kant didn't really seem to take that point, or never discussed why animals should be means to our ends, but young children should not be mean-swearing. So I think there was a mistake there.
Yeah.
And there are other thinkers too. I mean, there are Catholic thinkers. Charles Camosi is a professor in America who certainly thinks that factory farming distorts the nature of God's creatures and should be rejected for that reason. There are social contract theorists who think that we can extend the model of the social contract to non-human animals. So philosophers from a whole range of different perspectives have now, I think, agreed that the way we're treating animals, at least in factory farms, if not in all cases, is wrong.
Oh yes, that is an overall conclusion that you would make.
I think. Well,
yeah?
I mean,
yeah?
I'm sure you can find some exceptions, but I think that there is there's a majority consensus, I would say, for that view. And I'm talking about Western philosophy, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm wondering if there is, how is it possible it doesn't get picked up much more?
Well, I mean, I think there are relatively few philosophers who are out there in public as much as I am, and they tend to write books for other philosophers. Some of these things do get around. I mean, another philosopher I haven't mentioned is Martha Nussbaum, who wrote a book a year or two ago called Justice for Animals, which did get some attention in the newspapers. So I think there's more of it is getting around. But
So I guess I do see this, that these books or these people are being picked up, but like politics and society is not picking up on these views of philosophers. If philosophers kind of conclusively say it's wrong the way we are using animals right now, how is it possible that we just keep doing this in society?
Philosophers have the luxury of being able to follow reason wherever it leads. Politicians don't, because if they get too far ahead of the public, they're not going to get elected, and their aim is to be elected to office, which is reasonable, because if you're not elected, you can't do the things that you believe are good to do.
Yeah.
But so I think the fact that the public as a whole is still meat-eating means that relatively few politicians are prepared to stand up and say what we're doing to animals is wrong, and if we can get a majority in Parliament, we're going to stop factory farming.
Would you pledge for more philosophers who get out there to take a bit more of an activist stance? And then I'm talking about animals right now, but it could be about other moral things as well.
Yes, I think philosophers do have a role to talk to the public, to make their views accessible to the public, and to get out there and argue for why they think those views are correct.
Yeah. And then is there a chance, I mean, where is the border then between science and activism? Has that been hard for you to be associated with this one viewpoint?
Well, it's not that hard. I think it's not so much the border between science and activism. It's the border between teaching, being a teacher, an educator, and being an advocate for one position. So I've always been careful when I'm teaching to find readings for my students that were opposed to the views that I hold, because I want them to understand what my views are, what alternative views there might be, and totally free. In fact, they're encouraged in their essays to criticize things that I've said. So I think, I don't want students to write essays that simply give back to me what I've said to them in lectures. That's not philosophy. Is supposed to teach students to think, and being with no disrespect to parrots, but just repeating what your teacher has said, parroting it, as we might say, is not original thinking. So I think that's the most important distinction. Apart from that, you can certainly you can argue in more academic articles that you want to publish in peer-reviewed journals. You need a more rigorous, detailed argument than if you're putting something out for the general public, and so that's a line that you have to draw as well.
We recently had a survey amongst all our listeners. Over 300 people responded. And one of the things that came out is that they really want to know, what can I do? What should I do to help the cause forward? And I'm wondering, I would actually like to turn it around and asking you, after 50 years of experience in the animal field, what is the worst thing people can do?
The worst thing people can do? Well, the worst thing people can do is just to go on buying factory farmed products and eating whatever's cheapest, and that's one bad thing to do. If they are already convinced that that's wrong, then they shouldn't do it, and they should also be prepared to talk about it. Because I think this is one of the barriers that if people take this view you mentioned before of saying, well, this is just my view, but you're entitled to your view. I think it's actually not a good thing to do. I think you need to make people realise just what they are doing when they support factory farming and why you object to that, and not say, this is just my view. You should say, this is really something that everybody should know about, and I think all decent people, all people who live ethical lives, should cease to support it.
Yes, so they should talk about it, but be open in a conversation.
Yes,
to others.
Not too preachy. Listen to what the other person is saying, but just say, are you aware of the way in which these animals are treated? Can you really support that? If there are people who have a dog or cat, you can say, well, this pig, imagine that your dog was treated like this pig was treated, right? The dogs and pigs are both intelligent mammals. What would you think if somebody treated your dog in the way that pigs are treated?
This is always a good starting point.
It is when people are concerned about dogs or cats. Of course, not everybody is. But
and then when we make it a bit bigger and we talk about the movement, what in the animal movement is strategically things that we should be doing right now?
Well, I don't think there's anything particularly obvious that we should be doing that we're not doing in the animal movement. I think people are trying all sorts of tactics and trying to follow up and see what works and what doesn't work. That may be different in different countries and different cultures. So, I would say, I think in general you should be reasonably respectful to people, but nevertheless, as I was saying, try to inform them about why we should be shifting what we're eating away from factory farms and maybe away from animal foods to plant foods in general.
And are you most optimistic about activism that is geared at showing people what's happening at farms, about the animals basically, or do you think we should much more aim at diet change or more lab meat, for instance, of making plant-based alternatives? Which part of the movement do you think will have most success?
Well, I mean, that's very hard to predict, because if the plant-based alternatives or the cellular meat alternatives were to be competitive in price with meat and competitive in tastes that people like, that would be wonderful. But we've been talking about that for a long time now, and we don't really have those products. Are you becoming a bit disappointed? Or? I'm disappointed at the potential of both. Well, with cultured meat, people have been telling us that it's 5 years away for about 20 years now. So yes, I'm disappointed that we don't have those products. I mean, we have. I've actually eaten cellular chicken in Singapore where it's available, but it's still expensive, and that's why it's not widely available. And it didn't taste particularly good to me. Have you lost your faith in the possibility of making cellular meat? No, I still think it's possible, but it's obviously much harder than the people who were boosting it a decade or two ago thought it is. Yeah. And then again, from a strategic point of view, when you have your time or your money to put somewhere to help animals, would you want to put it in these companies making cellular meat, or would you want to put it in, let's say, PETA, which makes people aware on animal suffering? I mean, I've tried both, actually. I did put a small amount of money into a couple of startups that people invited me to do. So far, none of them are producing products, but maybe one day one of them will. But I also donate to a lot of animal organisations, particularly, of course, those that are working for factory farmed animals. And also, because of what we were talking about before, some of those that are working in Asia to try to get better practices in farming in Asia too. Yeah, good. Let me finally ask you, Peter, where do you get the energy to keep going, to maintain so sharp, to have all these details in your head and to travel the world and to keep working on these animals, but also other philosophical topics? Well, I think it's good to have a purpose in life. I think, if I didn't, I would just give up. I don't know what I would be doing. But I think that feeling that you're doing something worthwhile is an important contribution to happiness in the broad sense, to feeling that one's life is fulfilling and satisfying. So I'm glad that I have this opportunity to continue to do these things.
Yeah, so the purpose in life is an important thing, but then is there a certain life hack that you do in terms of what you eat or how you work out or how you sleep, or something that you can share with us to stay as bright as you are at 78?
Well, I think I have been eating a healthy diet for 55 years since I became vegetarian and then moved towards being vegan. So I think that's a good factor in it. I exercise. I do take breaks. My wife and I still go hiking and enjoy being outside. So I think all of those things are important as well.
Okay. And you're planning to continue working for the next few years?
As long as I feel that I can make a useful contribution, yes.
Okay. Well, so far you certainly have, and I'm optimistic that you will continue to do so. So thank you very much for this interview and for all your work in the past 50 years.
Thank you. It's been good talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. You might also be interested in a podcast Peter Singer makes called Lives Well Lived. And if you want to hear more of our interviews, please subscribe to our channel Studio Plantaardig through the link below.